The Appalachian air was heavier than I would imagined, thick with the scent of damp pine, old moss, and something faintly metallic. It clung to the back of my throat as if warning me to turn back. I had driven 7 hours to get here, a forgotten stretch of the Blue Ridge where the mountains rolled like sleeping giants. The town I had passed through, a cluster of rusted trailers and peeling storefronts, seemed to watch me leave without a word. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe if you like real horror. The man at the gas station had barely looked up when I asked about the unmarked trail near Hollow Bend. He only muttered that the old paths weren't for tourists anymore. The trailhead itself wasn't much, just a break in the tree line, framed by 2 rotting fence posts. No sign, no map, nothing to say where it led. My pack felt heavier than usual, though I'd only brought the essentials. The sky above was that strange Appalachian gray, the kind that makes it impossible to tell what time of day it is. Somewhere deep inside me, a small voice kept whispering that this was a bad idea. But the other voice, the one that had driven me here, said I needed to see it for myself. The first mile was nothing but switchbacks, the forest closing in until the daylight became a muted green haze. My boots sank slightly into the wet soil, each step pulling at my ankles, as if the earth wanted me to stay. I stopped once to take a sip from my canteen, and that was when I realized the forest was unnervingly quiet. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own breath, loud and uneven. By the 3rd mile, the trail narrowed into a dark corridor of blackened spruce. The air grew colder, and with it came a smell I couldn't place something like whetstone mixed with the faint sweetness of decay. My flashlight beam jittered over the undergrowth, catching shapes in the periphery that vanished when I turned my head. I told myself it was just shadows, just the tricks of an unfamiliar place. Then I saw it, a wooden sign nailed crooked to a tree, half buried in moss. The words were barely legible, but I could make out a single phrase: "Turn back before dark." My hand tightened around my trekking pole, but my feet kept moving forward. That was when the trail dipped suddenly, and I saw that the soil ahead was darker, almost black, and littered with bones, no larger than a hand. I don't know why I kept going. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the sick pull of curiosity. All I knew was that the further I went, the less it felt like I was walking on any map that had ever existed. The trail narrowed the farther I went, twisting like a snake around the ridges, forcing me to place each step with precision. The air had shifted in a way that I couldn't quite explain, heavier, colder, as if the sun had been pulled behind a curtain. The shadows from the tall, gnarled pines seemed to lean in toward me, stretching unnaturally long across the damp earth. My breath came out in soft clouds that dissipated almost instantly, swallowed by the dense air. The silence was strange, not peaceful, but oppressive, as if the mountain was holding its breath. Even the occasional rustle of leaves didn't sound right. It was slower, more deliberate, almost like something was testing the weight of its own steps just out of sight. I passed a weathered wooden sign, half buried in the undergrowth, its lettering so faded it looked like old scars rather than paint. I brushed the moss away and squinted. The name carved there wasn't familiar, not on any map I'd studied. It wasn't the name of a trail or a town, but something older. The letters were uneven, carved deep by hand, and the more I stared at them, the more wrong they felt. Like they weren't in English at all, but close enough to trick you if you didn't look too hard. A low wind wound its way through the trees then, and I swear I heard a whisper ride along with it. Just one word, but too soft for me to catch. I told myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks, the way isolation does, but I realized I was gripping my hiking stick so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The dirt under my boots was damp now, clinging in clumps, and the ground seemed to slope downward, even though I hadn't been walking toward a valley. That sinking path made my stomach knot. Somewhere ahead, I caught sight of what looked like an old campsite, a ring of stones marking where a fire once burned, a blackened kettle half sunk into the mud. But there was something about it that stopped me from stepping closer. The grass and weeds hadn't grown back inside the fire ring. Though it looked abandoned for years, the soil inside was still dark, charred as if it had been burned last night. There was no ash, no scent of smoke, just that dead, scorched earth, untouched by time. I crouched to look closer and found the strangest thing: small, almost perfectly round depressions in the mud around the camp, spaced evenly apart. They weren't footprints, at least not human ones. Too small, too narrow, and there were dozens of them, circling the fire pit, like something had danced there in slow, deliberate steps. The hair on my arms stood on end. When I looked up, I noticed something else. The path I'd come from no longer looked familiar. The trees seemed taller, older. The light was dimmer. I should been able to see the bend in the trail. I'd just walked around, but it was gone, replaced by a wall of thick underbrush that looked like it had been growing for decades. That was when I heard the sound, not the wind, not an animal. Something low, deep, and rhythmic, almost like a voice humming far away. I turned toward it, but the moment I moved, the sound stopped. The forest around me was still again, too still, and the unsettling thought crept in uninvited. Maybe it wasn't that the mountain was holding its breath. Maybe it was listening. By the time I pushed further up the trail, my legs were screaming from the climb. But the air had grown strangely still, as though the wind had been choked out of the world. I realized I could no longer hear the occasional rustle of leaves from the trees below. There was no bird call, no chirping insects. The silence was so complete, it felt like I had been dropped into a void. And every crunch of my boots on the dirt seemed far too loud, like it didn't belong in this place. Then the fog began to move differently. It wasn't just swirling anymore, it was drifting in long, deliberate ribbons, sliding between the trees and curling toward me as if it had a mind of its own. I stopped, breath clouding in front of my face, and felt the temperature drop another notch. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making you feel older, weaker. That's when I heard it faint at first, like someone mumbling from far away. I turned quickly, scanning the slopes around me, but there was no one there. The trail behind me was swallowed entirely by white, and I realized how easily I could get lost if I strayed even a few feet from the path. The mumbling grew clearer. It was a voice, low and hoarse, like someone speaking through clenched teeth. I couldn't make out the words, but it had the unmistakable rhythm of speech. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I called out something I regretted the second the sound left my mouth. My voice seemed to vanish into the mist without echo, as though the fog swallowed it whole. The reply came instantly, closer now, a wet, rasping sound that wasn't quite human, but carried the shape of human words. My brain tried to latch onto them, but they twisted just out of understanding, like a dream slipping away when you wake. I took a step back, my heel catching on a root, and I nearly went down. When I steadied myself, I noticed something strange about the trees ahead. Their bark was dark, almost black, and their trunks were too evenly spaced, like they had been planted on purpose. Between them, faint shapes shifted, just barely visible through the fog, tall, thin silhouettes, standing perfectly still. I froze, thinking it was my imagination, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became that they weren't trees at all. They were standing figures, motionless, facing me. I couldn't see faces, only the suggestion of heads and shoulders, but their presence was undeniable. The voice returned, now joined by others, a chorus of whispers, bleeding together until the sound felt like it was inside my skull. My legs moved without me meaning to, carrying me backward, down the trail, away from those shapes. That S, when I made the mistake of glancing to my right and saw one of them standing much closer than the rest, its head cocked at a sharp angle, as though it had been watching me the whole time. I didn't remember turning. I didn't remember running. I only remember the crushing sensation in my chest as I stumbled down the trail, desperate to find my way back, and the knowledge that the fog was following me. The farther I ran, the thicker the fog became, swallowing the trail behind me like it was erasing my steps from the world. My lungs burned with every breath, ragged and desperate, and my heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo through the empty forest. But the worst part wasn't the exhaustion, or the cold. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could hear something moving just beyond the edge of my vision. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching on dead leaves and twigs, never quite matching my pace, always just behind. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but all I saw was white haze and the dark silhouettes of trees bending in the fog. No sign of the shapes from before, but the feeling of being hunted grew heavier with every second. My mind flickered to the old stories my grandfather used to tell about the hollows, places in the Appalachians where the veil between the living and the dead thinned, where the mountain itself breathed secrets in forgotten tongues. He warned of spirits that weren't content with being left alone. They craved company, and if you wandered too deep, they'd claim you for their own. I didn't want to believe any of it until the sound of whispering rose around me, thick as smoke. The voices weren't just in my head anymore. They floated between the trees, impossible to pinpoint, but everywhere at once. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow darting between two trees, faster than any animal should be. I froze, straining to see through the fog, and suddenly, a cold hand brushed my shoulder. I jerked around, but no one was there. Just the empty woods, the whispering voices, and the fog swirling like living smoke. My skin prickled with terror, and I realized I'd dropped my flashlight somewhere in the scramble. Panic threatened to swallow me whole. I fumbled in my pack for my phone, but the screen was cracked, the battery nearly dead. I tried calling out, but my voice barely broke the eerie silence. Then I heard it, a low growl, not far away, deep and guttural. The sound froze me in place. It wasn't an animal I'd ever heard before. It was something old, ancient, and hungry. The temperature plummeted, breath crystallizing in the air, and the fog twisted into shapes that looked like hands reaching out from the earth itself. I took a step back, and my foot hit something solid. I looked down to see a rusty, twisted chain buried in the dirt, leading off into the mist like a leash tethering something unseen. And then the growl came again, louder this time, and I realized with a sinking heart that whatever was out here wasn't just watching, it was closing in. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared down the length of the rusty chain. It disappeared into the fog, pulled taut like it was anchoring something terrible to this world. The growling grew louder, now mixed with wet, scraping noises that sent ice-cold dread crawling up my spine. I wanted to run, to tear away from this cursed place, but my legs felt rooted to the earth. The whispers surrounded me now, a chorus of broken voices, pleading, threatening, echoing from every shadow. I could swear they called my name, but when I tried to answer, my voice was swallowed whole. Then, from the fog, it came a shape rising slow and twisted, half glimpsed, but undeniably real. The thing was monstrous, a mass of shadows and rotting flesh, with eyes that burned a cold, unnatural blue. Its breath was a fetid fog of decay and death, and it moved with the terrible purpose of a predator that has waited centuries for its prey. I stumbled backward, heart hammering like a drum of doom, but the chain suddenly jerked tight in my hand. The creature was tethered, held by that rusted metal, but it didn't seem to care. Its eyes locked on mine, and I felt a pull, a terrible promise in its gaze. If I tried to run, it would break free, and whatever waited beyond these mountains would spill out into the world. Panic surged, but somewhere deep inside, a shred of reason fought to breathe. This wasn't just some wild animal or a ghost story. This was something ancient, a curse born from the mountain's darkest heart, fed on fear and death and forgotten sins. I dropped the chain and turned to flee, scrambling blindly through the fog, guided only by instinct and sheer terror. Branches tore at my clothes, roots threatened to trip me, and the growls behind me shifted into a chorus of agonized screams that rattled the night. I burst through the tree line at the edge of the hollow, the fog thinning as dawn's first light touched the ridge. The voices faded, the growls stilled, but the weight of the mountain's curse settled heavy on my chest. I never spoke of what happened that day. Some things are too dark, too dangerous to share with the world. But if you ever find yourself hiking the Appalachian trails near that forgotten hollow, remember this: some places are better left alone. When the fog rolls in and the silence presses tight, don't follow the whispers, don't chase the shadows, and whatever you do, don't touch the rusted chain, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I never believed in mountain legends until the night I spent alone in the Appalachians near Black Hollow Ridge. I'd planned a simple solo hike, just me, my pack, and a trail leading into thick forest. But things went wrong almost as soon as I stepped off the main path. By dusk, I'd found a small clearing and set up camp near an old fire ring. The trees around me whispered with the wind, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch like fingers reaching for me. I thought it was just my imagination. After making a small fire, I settled down with some jerky and a flask of whiskey, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. The sun dipped below the ridges, and the forest darkened until all that was left was the orange glow of my campfire and the crunch of leaves underfoot somewhere nearby. That's when I heard it, a low humming, almost like a chant drifting through the trees. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it was deliberate, slow, unnerving. I stood, listening, heart pounding, but saw nothing through the thick brush. I called out once, twice, no answer, just the humming growing louder and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods, but the beam caught nothing but empty trees and shifting shadows. Still, the feeling of eyes on me wouldn't go away. The hum became words, old words, spoken in a tongue I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. I wanted to pack up and leave. But as I reached to douse the fire, something cracked behind me, a snap of a branch, quick and sharp. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing. Then the chanting stopped. Silence slammed into the night, heavier than before. That S, when I saw the first mark, a symbol carved deep into the bark of a nearby tree. Jagged lines forming something ancient and angry. I had a choice: run back down the mountain or follow the trail of those marks deeper into the forest. I chose to follow. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, and the dense canopy swallowed most of the stars. I followed the carved symbols from tree to tree, each one more twisted and desperate than the last. The bark looked fresh where the marks had been made, like something or someone had been out here recently. I wanted to turn back, but some part of me was hooked, drawn forward by a force I couldn't explain. As I moved deeper, the trees grew tighter together, their limbs clawing at the sky like the fingers of old ghosts. The forest floor was littered with dried leaves and broken twigs, but also something else strange: footprints, half hidden and smeared in dark patches that looked disturbingly like old blood. I swallowed hard and pressed on, the chanting from before now just a distant echo in my mind. My breath came faster, and every rustle made me jump. Somewhere, an owl hooted, but it sounded too close, too deliberate, like a warning. Suddenly, I came to a small clearing, and in the center was a stone altar, covered in moss and faded symbols that pulsed with a faint, unnatural glow. Around it, the earth was disturbed, churned as if something had been dragged across the soil recently. The air tasted metallic and thick, and a sour smell made my stomach twist. I shined the flashlight around the clearing and caught sight of a circle of bones, bleached white and arranged with cruel precision. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This wasn't just an abandoned ritual site. Someone had been here. Someone or something was still watching. Before I could decide what to do, a sudden snap came from the edge of the clearing. I whipped around, but the fog that had started creeping in swallowed any sight of movement. A voice, low and gravelly, whispered my name, and I realized I was no longer alone. The whisper slithered through the air again, my name barely more than a breath. My flashlight flickered violently, casting wild shadows that danced like specters across the trees. I took a shaky step back toward the altar, but the fog had thickened, curling around my boots like living smoke. Every direction looked the same, a swirling maze of ghostly white and black trunks. Then I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Not fully visible, more like a blur, but unmistakably human in shape. It didn't move, but I felt its eyes burning into me. "Who's there?" I called, voice cracking under the weight of fear. No answer, just silence and that chilling sensation of being watched. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use its light or call for help, but the screen stayed black, dead. Like the forest itself had swallowed the signal hole, the figure shifted slightly, and suddenly the ground beneath me trembled, subtle at first, then growing into a low rumble that seemed to come from deep inside the mountain. A cold wind whipped through the clearing, carrying a smell like damp earth and something fouler, something like burning hair. The bones in the circle rattled as if stirred by invisible fingers. Panic clawed at my throat. I stumbled back, and the whisper returned, louder now, filled with anger and sorrow. "Leave or stay forever." A scream tore through the night, sudden and primal, echoing from the depths of the woods. I turned and ran blindly into the fog, branches slashing my face and tearing my clothes. Behind me, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, followed. My heart pounded in my ears as I sprinted through the darkness, the whisper chasing me, growing louder with every step. I didn't stop running, not for a second. The forest closed in around me like a living nightmare, branches snagging my clothes and tearing at my skin, roots threatening to trip me at every desperate step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the footsteps behind me never faltered. They were patient, deliberate, the sound of someone or something matching my pace without haste, as if it knew I would never outrun it. The fog thickened, swallowing the trail and twisting the trees into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer down at me. My flashlight was dead, my phone useless. I was blind in a world that refused to be seen clearly. Then came the sound, not footsteps, but a low, guttural growl vibrating through the air, so deep and raw that it felt like the mountain itself was warning me, telling me to turn back or be swallowed whole. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stumbled into a ditch, scraping my palms and knees on the rough rocks, but I forced myself up. There was no choice. Behind me, the growling morphed into voices, terrible, twisted voices, speaking in a language older than time. Their words weren't meant to be understood, only feared. I forced my way through a thicket of brambles and hit a small ridge overlooking a narrow valley cloaked in mist. Down below, I caught sight of an old stone structure, half swallowed by vines, a crumbling cabin, its windows shattered and door hanging crooked on its hinges. It looked abandoned for decades. Desperation pushed me toward it, the only shelter I could see in this wilderness of shadows. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust, but it smelled faintly of smoke and decay. I dropped my pack by the door and searched for anything useful. My hands found a rusted hunting knife on the floor, its blade dull, but better than nothing. Then I saw the walls covered in symbols, carved deep and jagged, similar to those I'd seen on the trees, but far more numerous and chaotic. In the dim light, they seemed to crawl and shift like living things. On a splintered wooden table lay an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I flipped it open, my fingers trembling, and began reading. The entries were written by someone named Eli, a woodsman who had lived here long ago. His words spoke of a curse upon the mountain, a dark presence that awakened when the fog rolled in, claiming the souls of those who dared to enter its heart. Eli wrote of neighbors disappearing, strange lights in the woods, and a shadowy figure that haunted the ridges at night. His final entry was a warning: do not trust the fog, do not follow the marks. The mountain takes what it wants, and it does not give back. If you value your soul, turn away now before the watcher finds you. A sudden noise made me jump. The cabin door creaked slowly shut behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but no one was there. The growling had returned, louder and closer than ever. I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there wasn't going to let me live. Scrambled to the cabin door, wrenching it open and fleeing into the fog-cloaked woods. But the mountain wasn't done with me. The growls chased me like a living nightmare, echoing from every direction no matter where I turned. I felt the eyes of something ancient and cruel locked onto me. Branches grabbed at my face and arms, tearing skin, but I barely noticed. My mind was consumed by a single thought: survive. I ran blindly, my footfalls lost in the mist. Then, just ahead, the ground gave way beneath me. I plunged into a cold, dark pit. Pain exploded through my leg, but I was alive. I fumbled for my flashlight, dead. The journal's words echoed in my head, warning of the curse, the watcher, the fog that claimed souls. A shadow loomed above, immense and dark, blocking out what little moonlight remained. It whispered, a voice like cracked stone and distant thunder. You walked where you should not have. You saw what you were never meant to see. Now the mountain owns your soul. I tried to scream, but the words died in my throat as the shadow's coldness seeped into my bones. Time fractured, the air thickened, and the walls of the pit seemed to close in. The last thing I saw was the twisted grin of something not quite human watching, waiting, hungry. If you ever find yourself in the Appalachian Mountains and see strange marks on the trees, or hear whispers carried on the wind, heed this warning. Turn back. Do not follow the path into the fog. Do not seek the cabin or the altar in the clearing. There are forces here older than the mountains themselves, and they do not forgive trespassers. The mountain watches, the mountain waits, and once it claims you, there is no escape. Stay away, stay alive. I never thought the Appalachian Mountains would be the place I'd lose more than just my way. It was early October, the kind of crisp fall day that makes the trees glow fiery red and gold, the perfect weather for a weekend hike. I was with two friends, Mark and Jessica, and we planned a long trek on one of the lesser-known trails near Blackwater Falls. The path was rough but manageable, twisting through thick pine and hardwood forests, the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves heavy in the air. We joked and talked as we climbed, the kind of lightheartedness that only comes with the safety of daylight and company. Around midday, we stopped near a small clearing to rest and eat. That's when I noticed something odd, a narrow, faint path veering off the main trail, almost hidden by underbrush and shadows. It looked like it hadn't been traveled much, maybe a game trail or an old logging route. Should we check it out? Jessica asked, curiosity lighting her eyes. I hesitated. There was something off about it, a strange stillness in the air, as if the forest was holding its breath. But the thrill of adventure won out. We agreed to follow the side path for a bit, thinking it might loop back to the main trail further ahead. The further we went, the thicker the fog began to settle around us, turning the vibrant forest into a blurry, silent world. The trail narrowed, the trees crowding closer until the sunlight barely touched the ground. The air grew colder, heavier, and every step felt like sinking deeper into some unseen trap. Then, without warning, Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We strained our ears, but all we could hear was the soft rustle of leaves and a distant bird call, or so we thought. From the fog came a low, almost imperceptible hum, a sound like an ancient chant echoing through the trees. It wasn't coming from anywhere we could see. Mark frowned. "Probably just some campers or hunters," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I wanted to agree, to brush it off as imagination, but my gut twisted tight with unease. Something was wrong. Then the trail ended abruptly, just a sheer drop into a rocky ravine. There were no footprints, no signs of recent passage, and the chanting stopped. A silence fell over the forest so thick it pressed against my ears. "We need to get back," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Jessica nodded, eyes wide. Mark took a step back the way we came. But the fog shifted behind us, and through it, a figure appeared, tall, thin, wrapped in tattered gray cloth that fluttered, even though the air was still. Its face was hidden in shadows, but I felt its gaze pierce through me like cold steel. We froze. The figure raised one pale, skeletal hand and pointed deeper into the woods, and then it vanished. We stood frozen for a moment, the silence thicker than before, our breaths loud in the heavy air. That figure, whatever it was, had disappeared as suddenly as it came, leaving nothing but a chilling emptiness in its wake. Jessica broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave, now." Mark swallowed hard, but didn't argue. I agreed. The strange chanting, the ghostly figure, none of it felt natural. Whatever we stumbled onto wasn't just an old trail or forgotten path. It was something else. Turning back the way we came, the fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around the trees like spectral fingers, obscuring the path we'd just walked. The forest, once vibrant and alive, felt oppressive, as if it were closing in on us. The hum started again, this time louder, more insistent, like a distant song carried on the wind, calling us deeper into the mountains. Our footsteps quickened, but the trail seemed to twist and turn on its own, confusing us. Landmarks we'd passed earlier appeared unfamiliar or gone altogether. "Are we even going the right way?" Jessica's voice cracked with fear. I glanced back, but the forest was a swirling sea of gray mist. Then I saw it, faint lights flickering in the distance, like lanterns held by unseen hands. Hope flickered. Maybe those were other hikers or campers. Maybe we could find help. We pushed toward the lights, the chanting growing louder, now layered with whispers and the rustling of dead leaves. As we neared, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing, and at its center, a circle of ancient stones, worn and covered with moss. Symbols were carved deep into the stones, twisting, jagged marks I'd never seen before. But they felt oddly familiar, as if echoing some forgotten memory. The chanting pulsed from the circle itself, a low vibration that seemed to resonate with the very ground beneath our feet. Mark stepped closer, drawn like a moth to a flame. "This has to be some kind of ritual site," he said, voice hushed. Suddenly, the fog parted behind us, and the figure returned silent and motionless at the edge of the clearing. Its skeletal hand lifted slowly, pointing directly at Mark. A cold wind whipped through the trees, extinguishing the faint lanterns and plunging us into darkness. I tried to shout a warning, but the words caught in my throat. Mark's eyes went wide with terror as he suddenly collapsed, clutching his chest. The chanting swelled, filling the night with a terrible, otherworldly sound. Jessica screamed, grabbing my arm, urging me to run, but I knew some part of Mark had been claimed by something ancient, something evil, hidden deep in these Appalachian hills. And as the night closed in, I realized we had crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. The night swallowed us whole. Jessica pulled me away from the clearing, dragging me through the thick underbrush and twisted roots. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would burst, echoing louder than the sinister chanting fading behind us. Mark's collapse haunted every step. I glanced back once his body lay crumpled at the stone circle's edge, pale as death itself. But his eyes were open and unseeing, staring blankly into the darkness. We pushed forward blindly, branches slapping our faces, the cold mountain air biting at our skin. The fog was a living thing, weaving in and out of the trees, obscuring our way. It wasn't just mist, it felt like a veil between worlds, thin and trembling. Which way now? Jessica's voice cracked with panic. "I don't know," I admitted, swallowing the lump of fear that had lodged in my throat. We tried to retrace our steps, but the forest had changed. Trees shifted in impossible ways. A path that seemed clear a moment ago vanished like smoke, replaced by dense brambles and thorny vines. Then came the whispering, not the chanting from before, but low, urgent voices, speaking in a language older than time, incomprehensible but filled with menace. They seemed to come from every direction, circling us like wolves closing in on prey. A sudden movement caught my eye, a flash of pale skin, a glint of something metallic among the trees. I froze. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Jessica nodded, wide-eyed, clutching my arm. "We're not alone." Our footsteps faltered as shadows danced just beyond sight. The forest no longer felt like a place of nature, but a trap, a labyrinth designed to keep us inside, to break us down. Hours passed, or maybe minutes' time, lost all meaning in that suffocating gloom. My legs grew weak, my breath came in ragged gasps, and then I heard it, the unmistakable snap of a twig breaking. From the darkness, figures emerged, gaunt, twisted forms draped in tattered rags, faces obscured by deep shadows. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting a hunger that chilled me to the bone. They didn't speak, they didn't run, they simply watched, stepping silently, surrounding us like the forest itself had come alive with malice. Jessica grabbed my hand, pulling me to run, but I stumbled, and a cold, clawed hand caught my wrist. Panic surged, but my mind went numb as the creature's grip tightened. I felt its breath, cold and fetid, on my skin, smelled the decay of something long dead. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the creatures vanished, retreating into the shadows as the first pale light of dawn pierced the canopy. Jessica and I collapsed to the forest floor, shaking and breathless. "We need to get out," she whispered. I nodded, but deep down I knew we were lost, lost to the mountain, lost to the curse that haunted these woods. And the worst part, the feeling that whatever had taken Mark was still out there, waiting for us to falter. The dawn barely cut through the thick canopy, and even the morning air felt heavy, suffused with an eerie stillness that pressed against our chests like a weight. Jessica and I stumbled forward, each step harder than the last, the forest twisting around us like a living maze, determined to swallow us whole. My mind replayed the image of Mark pale, eyes vacant, and the cruel, cold grip that had almost claimed me. I could still feel the icy brush of that clawed hand on my skin, the smell of death clinging to my clothes. We found ourselves at the edge of a clearing where an old, rusted sign hung crookedly on a post: "Beware, keep out private land." The paint was peeling, letters barely legible, but the warning was clear. Jessica hesitated, her voice trembling. "Do we dare go any further? Maybe there's a way out this way." I swallowed my fear and nodded, desperate for any escape from this nightmare. But as we crossed into the clearing, the ground beneath our feet seemed to shift. Suddenly, the forest grew silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, suffocating silence that screamed louder than any noise. Then, from the shadows at the clearing's edge, something moved slow, deliberate. A figure appeared, tall and gaunt, face obscured beneath a hood woven from dead leaves and branches. Its eyes glowed faintly, cold and unblinking. Jessica gasped and grabbed my arm. What is that?" The figure did not answer. It stepped forward, and the air grew colder, the scent of decay growing stronger. I felt a primal terror rising in my gut, This was no human, no lost hiker or local dis, was something else entirely. Without warning, the figure raised a crooked hand, and the earth beneath us trembled. From the ground, twisted roots and thorny vines erupted, snaking toward us like hungry serpents. We turned to run, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. Trees shifted, blocking our path. The thorns tore at our clothes and skin, drawing blood. The whispers returned, 1,000 voices chanting in a language older than the mountains themselves. In that moment, I realized the truth. These woods weren't just haunted by ghosts or lost souls. They were alive, and they were hungry. Jessica screamed as a vine wrapped tightly around her ankle, pulling her down. I fought to free her, slashing at the snarling plants with my pocket knife, but they only multiplied. A sudden burst of light cut through the gloom, a flare from Jessica's backpack. She fumbled with it, igniting it just as the hooded figure advanced, its form dissolving into shadows that writhed and twisted like smoke. The light made it recoil, and the vines slackened their grip. We scrambled to our feet, adrenaline fueling our escape. As we ran blindly, the chanting faded, replaced by an overwhelming silence that pressed in on us like a tomb. Hours later, when we finally broke through the forest's edge into the pale light of dawn, the mountains behind us loomed dark and silent, hiding secrets no one should ever uncover. But even as we collapsed on the roadside, gasping and trembling, I knew the horror wasn't over. The mountain had marked us, and whatever dwelled in those ancient woods would never let us go. We never spoke much about what happened after we escaped those woods. The experience was too raw, too terrifying to put into words. The doctors said our bodies had suffered from exposure and dehydration, but no one could explain the bruises, the scratches, or the deep cuts on our arms, as if the forest itself had reached inside us. The police questioned us, but found no evidence of the hooded figure or the strange vines. The forest showed no signs of disturbance, no footprints except ours, and the clearing where we had encountered the nightmare looked ordinary, almost inviting, like a postcard of peaceful wilderness. But we knew better. At night, the memories crept in the whispers, the cold breath against our necks, the unblinking eyes watching from the shadows. I would lie awake, heart pounding, certain something was waiting just outside my window, ready to drag me back into that living nightmare. Jessica's nightmares were worse. She would scream, thrashing and clawing at the sheets, muttering in that ancient tongue we never understood but somehow feared. Friends and family told us to move on, to forget the mountain, but how could we? The Appalachian woods had marked us, woven their dark curse into our blood, and then a letter arrived. No return address, no signature, just a single piece of aged paper with 3 words scrawled in that same cryptic script we'd seen in the tunnels. You belong here. That was the last straw. We left the town, left the mountains behind, but even now, years later, the feeling lingers. A cold presence watching from the tree line, a whisper on the wind, a shadow flickering just beyond sight. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Appalachian Mountains, take heed. Respect the forest, heed the warnings carved into the bark, and never, ever stray from the path. Because some places aren't meant for us. Some darkness is hungry, and once it finds you, it never lets go. The Appalachian Mountains hide secrets older than time itself. Many who wander too far off the trail never return or come back changed. If you value your life and your sanity, stay on marked paths, avoid abandoned ruins, and never ignore the whispers of the forest. The woods have eyes, the woods have teeth, and they are always watching.